Hey, Cassie, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, should we get started, or do you have everything set up, Cassie?
Yes, now we can get started.
Okay, great. And it looks like we're still waiting on potentially two, but we can get started. So welcome everybody to the July Environment and Climate Committee meeting. We'll get started this morning with, it's still morning, with roll call, and then we'll jump into the meeting agenda. So for roll call, I'll say your name and say that you are here. We'll start with Bill.
Here.
Covey.
Here.
Kersey.
Here.
Mark Buckley.
Here.
Neil Bonsgard, present. Rory Isbell.
Here.
Serena Dietrich.
Here.
And are either Peter Grube or Kelly Jensen here? Okay, it doesn't look like it for now, but we'll be sure to make note if they join later. Tess Gardner, alternate.
Here.
Annie Berkey. And I think I saw, and Sasha Sulia. Okay. So let's go ahead and jump into the agenda. As usual, we are a little full with our agenda, but we'll start with meeting minutes. Is there any conversation before we ask for a motion about meeting minutes? Doesn't sound like it. Does anybody want to make a motion to approve the meeting minutes?
Sure, it's Bill. I'll move to approve the meeting minutes as written.
Anybody want a second?
This is Rory.
I'll
second.
I think I heard a second from Rory. All in favor, raise your Zoom hand. And it looks like Kelly Jensen is just hopping in, so maybe give a second, Kelly, if you're here and want to say if you're here and if you can approve the meeting minutes. All right. Okay, let's jump into public comment. It does look like we have at least one person here. So as a reminder for public participation in the Environment and Climate Committee, everyone that's participating on Zoom has the ability to make public comment, and you're on mute right now. But if you raise your hand using the raise hand function, a staff member can call on your name and provide you the ability to unmute. Looks like we have one person here to make public comment, Allegra, and somebody should give you the option to unmute.
Yeah, so Allegra, I've given you the option to unmute your microphone and you can share your public comment, and you have 2 minutes. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. My name is Allegra Briggs and I live in Bend. And I would like to have the ability to email the committee. I went to the committee's website and there is no email address to the committee. There is an email address for a staff member, but I want to communicate with the committee because they're the ones who are making the decisions. So if you could add that, that would make it more equitable, so all citizens can communicate with the committee. What I wanted to send the committee was a picture of the tree equity score for the city of Bend. And it shows the different neighborhoods and what the tree equity score is for those different neighborhoods in Bend. And I would also like to send the link so that people can go to that map, that interactive map, and check it out for themselves. Trees are important for climate change because they suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. They get carbon out of the atmosphere, and also they provide shade. We've had a couple of deaths that were heat related in the recent heat wave, and nationwide, when you look at cities, there's a disparity between neighborhoods that have trees and those that don't. And not surprisingly, it's wealthy neighborhoods that have trees, and poor neighborhoods are lacking in trees. In fact, one study that I read said that the difference is for poor neighborhoods is that they have 41% less tree shade coverage compared to wealthy neighborhoods. That's a significant disparity. And also for neighborhoods that have large populations of people of color, they also have significantly less tree shade. And so this is a problem that is place-based, and there's also a solution that is place-based. And the impacts of climate change are felt most strongly by people of low income, people of color, and primarily the elderly poor. And I would like to see trees being part of the solution that this committee is looking at, because it's a multi-pronged approach that we need to take to fight climate change. It's very important.
Allegra, you have reached your 2-minute limit, so if you could just wrap up in the next couple of seconds, thanks.
Yes, I just want to say, please look at this. It's an important aspect that we should add in our fight against climate change. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Allegra, for your public comment. And one of our next topics is going to be talking a little bit about that kind of communication. I also wanted to make note that both Kelly and Peter were able to join, but Peter had to use my link. So if Cassie, if you can change his, I think you have to change his name in Zoom, because it looks like there's 2 Neil Bonsgaards in the meeting, which I can assure you there's only one.
I wonder why.
Well, he used my link to log in because he couldn't find his own link. Okay, so the next item on our agenda is updates, because I don't see any other public comment. And the first update is going to be from Cassie, and it is in response to last meeting's conversation about responding to community emails and how folks can get a hold of us on the committee. So I'll pass that over to Cassie.
Okay, I'm gonna stop my share really quick so we can all see each other a little better. But yeah, so I put together a memo kind of quickly touching on the responding to email. So that came up as something that we wanted as an agenda item for today to discuss, like how we respond to community requests. When talking with the chairs on our debrief, we decided that we didn't have time to hold space for a lengthy discussion on that today due to the other stuff that we need to get done. But also we revisited kind of what the discussion we had previously about how we want to respond to emails. And what we had discussed as a committee a couple of months back was that the process would be that committee members, when you get direct emails from community members, any committee member that is interested in the topic can email back. Like if it's something you wish to engage with or learn more about, you can email back and then just CC the chair, the vice chair, and the staff. So right, that would be Neil, Serena, and myself now, so that we have a couple of people kind of keeping tabs on like who's gotten responded to and what the responses are. And then I know that we talked about how there's a desire to make from the committee members to make sure that someone responds to the comments so that people aren't submitting comments that and then they're just feel like they're not getting responded to. So any comment that comes through me, like the ones that I forward to you all, which is the majority, my understanding is the majority of them so far. Those ones I do respond to the community member and I say, thank you for your comment. We have shared it with the committee. A lot of times I'll even share with them kind of like what the process is as far as getting the topic to a discussion. So the community members are responded to and they understand, and typically they respond back and say, thanks for letting me know. So we wanted to make sure you all understood that. So due to that, we didn't think it was necessarily necessary that a committee member responds to each and every one because staff are responding to each of them. The exception to that would be if you guys do get emails directly to yourselves, the ones that I don't get, those potentially don't get responded to, but someone can for those. So we were thinking that we would just continue to move forward with that system unless someone feels like there's a glaring problem with that system that you want to remedy. And I see Mary's popped up, so maybe she's got something to contribute.
The one caveat is if you get one to you that doesn't go to Cassie, our advice is that you always forward anything to Cassie, because if we get a public records request, we prefer not to have to ask you to search through your emails. If we know that the city has them all, then we just respond for you. But if you haven't forwarded everything, then we have to ask you to look through your computer. It could be if it was like for the last 2 years, and that's kind of a burden on you. So we ask you not to just respond to anything without making sure you always copy Cassie as a practice. So we can say that was your practice and you never did, and you don't have to look if we get a public records request.
That's a good point, Mary. And then I can also, that way too, I can even respond, just that kind of generic response of like, thank you for your comment. The ECC has, has received your comment. We can make sure all of those are covered. So maybe we can rely on Neil and Serena, if you get ones that are like clearly sent to all committee members, that you two or whoever the chair and vice chair are can be the ones that are on point for forwarding it to me, just so we can make sure that I've seen it and I can respond. And then certainly if any of you want to respond, CC me and the chairs as well. So like I said, we were hoping to keep just for the sake of time to not open up too large of a discussion on this, but we do want to hear from you to see if anyone has any problems with that approach, or like if there is a reason we should move it to a larger discussion. Bill?
Okay, so I guess what I'm hearing is, so if we got a response, I mean, of course we were going to reply, we would copy you. But if we felt it was something that needed the attention of the whole group, we would then contact either, the chair or vice chair or you, Cassie, and it would probably come up in the next agenda. That seems to make sense to me.
Well, I wrote in the memo too, to remember the agenda setting process that we have. So what we still want to do is if something comes up and then you all decide that you want to talk about it as a committee, the process that we have is the first place you can bring it up would be like the bike rack. So we have two opportunities in each meeting. There's a bike rack, which is just your opportunity to say, hey, this is something I think we should all discuss. Mm-hmm. That does not automatically move it to an agenda. that just kind of puts out there, this is something that I, as a committee member, think is important. But then when we do agenda setting at the end of each meeting, which we have admittedly, we've kind of run out of time for a lot of days. That's when that's when committee members can say, hey, I would actually like to make sure we hold time on the next agenda, or maybe in 2 agendas from now, to actually have a discussion on this topic. And at that point, what I would really recommend is, like we do with the council when they want to talk about a topic that wasn't originally in their work plan, is you do like a vote to see if the majority of committee members wants to allocate agenda time to that topic, just because there's so many different things that in order to make sure we're really spending our limited time on topics that the whole committee feels valuable, you want to make sure that there's a sufficient number of you that really feels like it's worth it. And the reason we do it like that, and we don't just say, hey, we got emails this week, can't we fit, a discussion in? For one, we typically, as you've noticed, don't have space on our agendas, at least so far. But 2, in order to have a good conversation about it, it is important that we have time to do some background prep and research, and make sure that we're having a discussion that's well informed, so that we avoid spending 45 minutes talking about a topic that we don't have good information for you all to kind of discuss.
So that vote would occur during the agenda setting process?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. That makes sense. You can't just pop something into the agenda that's not on without making a motion to change the agenda. Which,
yeah, and that's what we talked about at the last meeting. Mary suggested that at the beginning of the meeting. So if there is something super time sensitive, it's like this came up yesterday, and clearly there's a deadline we need to hit, and we know we have information today in order to respond before that deadline. That's the tricky part, because a lot of times if there's a deadline tomorrow and we just heard about it yesterday, we still don't have good information in order to contribute. But occasionally there's cases where you might, then you can make an motion to amend the agenda, and then you're making a decision to say, we're going to postpone this discussion we had planned for today to another day so we can create space for this.
yeah, sometimes meetings begin with approving the agenda. So that's where it would happen, I guess.
Does anyone else have any kind of concerns with this approach on I guess both the responding to emails and also the agenda setting process? Rory?
Yeah, not really a concern. I just want to make sure that it's, so let's see, the second sentence in the second paragraph of your memo, I just want to make sure we all still remember that, like, we can and maybe should respond to individuals who email us. I think this came up last time, but I think that's a very important purpose of this committee is to be an outlet for community concerns. So, we have to be careful about it. Like, don't CC everyone, because that would be a public meeting over email, when Mary will tell us why that's wrong. But I just want us to remember that as we talk through this. Like, I think that's an important role of ours, to be able to respond as individuals on this committee to issues that people bring up to us. And then the one other thing I wanted to mention is we had a request from Allegra, the public comment today, to make our email addresses available on the website. And if they're not easily found there, I would suggest that we do that and make it easy for community members to contact us via email.
Sure, it's not standard. I don't think we have any committees where we publish their publicly post their email addresses. Typically, I've shared the roster when people request the roster of it. I don't think, Mary, is there a reason? I'll ask Mary first if there's a reason we can't do that, and then I'll ask the committee if the whole committee feels comfortable having their emails publicly posted. Oh, you're muted.
It would be completely, because we haven't provided city email addresses to all the different committees and commissions. It would be just a question of your comfort level. I don't know if you have a separate email address for this committee or if it's your personal email. And so I would just say everybody needs to be okay with that being publicly posted. There's no legal reason why you can't. It's just your comfort level. I mean, we've just gotten an unfortunate slew of really awful emails to council, and unfortunately we were not able to block them because it came from an external source. We were having this whole discussion with IT as to why can't we just block those when there's certain words, and sometimes we can, but sometimes because of them being the way they can, this is getting beyond my skill set with IT, but apparently the way they came in, we can't block them. So it's just a warning to you that hopefully that won't happen, but if it did, that's not necessarily something we can always do. So it's just putting your email addresses out there to anybody that wants them.
Avi?
So I just wanted to add my thoughts. I think I'm okay with, I do have a separate ECC email created, so I'm okay with putting that online. But another option, because I know we also mentioned we want to make sure Cassie is on the emails as well, is if it's possible to create like a ECC at, the City of Bend email that automatically sends it to the whole committee and Cassie. And then that way everyone gets a copy of the email automatically, and it makes it easier for people who do want to do public comment that way to know that everyone's getting the email directly without having to go through a step through Cassie. So I don't know if that's possible to set up, but that might be another option I would suggest.
You mean having an ECC email address?
I think, yeah, it would be like ECC all, which I know that no other committees have that. So I just don't know. That might be something we need to talk about internally, because we probably would want to standardize that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the Planning Commission does. They would be the only ones that has it. And they're a little bit different because they have a role in land use decisions. So we've created a record for them. But yeah, let us talk about that internally, because it's a good idea if we can do it.
Yeah, and I think maybe one or two other committees, I think, has mentioned something like that too. So
yeah.
I saw Peter's hand and then Kersey.
Yeah, thanks. I really like Kavi's suggestion. I would be fully supportive of that, but I am not at all comfortable with my personal email going up.
Kersey?
Hey, and apologies. I'm part of the group in Bend who currently don't have internet. So doing my best here. Yeah, I'm also not comfortable having my email put on the website, but want to be transparent and accessible to the public and to the residents of Bend. So even just putting what our process is on the website of, this goes to city staff and then is forwarded to the committee, even just being transparent there on the website, I think might add some transparency and accessibility to the community.
That's a good idea, Kersey, and I can do that in the immediate term while we look into that like committee all email address, because I can just write that on there, like, if you'd like to contact committee members, please email me and I'll forward it to them. Mark?
Yeah, not to belabor this, but we have received emails in the past that seem to come to the entire committee. I know 350 Deschutes sent several. What was the mechanism for that?
So I've shared the roster. We have like a roster that we keep all your contact info, and I've shared that when requested.
Okay.
350 Deschutes was the only group that has requested that. And then I think I shared it with the person who came on behalf of the Dark Skies organization at the last meeting as well, or not the last meeting, but one of our previous meetings. Okay, well, it sounds like we're good with the process as far as people responding, CCing the chair and vice chair and staff. And like Rory said, you're definitely all free to do that. So if you all want to respond to someone, go ahead and do that. Just make sure that we're aware. Will forward me any emails that you all get directly. And then so that we also are aware of, just have those on our own record to avoid like less public record for you all responsibility. And then we'll look into the email option. So either setting up like a ECC all email address. I don't know how easy or difficult that will be to forward. But in the meantime, putting on the website, if you'd like to contact the committee members, you can email staff and forward it. So I think that'll be our plan. Okay. Okay, great. Well, then that was really the only update that Neil, were you going to say something?
No, I was just unmuting to see if you were if there were any other updates.
No, I didn't have any others. And I know we wanted to get to the report outs. I have 11:30s and so we still have the bike rack, so maybe we should move on to that.
Yep. It's 11:27 and we have the bike rack and we're right on schedule to be jumping into our first main agenda item at 11:30. So go ahead, Serena, with reminding us of what is on our exciting bike rack.
Well, I was looking, I just realized as I'm going through the packet that I don't see the bike rack information from, let's see.
Yeah, let me try to pull it up. I forgot to include it in the packet.
Yeah, I was looking at the meeting notes from last time, but I don't see. But anyway, I guess while Cassie's looking for that, is there anything that has happened between our last meeting and this current one that people feel we should address and add to the bike rack for future, for potentially putting on agenda? We're not asking for agenda items right now. We're asking for things to be put on the bike rack to be considered for agenda items in the future. If there's anything that you guys have come across anytime, anything over the last month, here it is. So thank you for that. So we currently have the tree code, the HOA rules around xeriscaping and requirements around that, climate emergency declaration. Dark Skies did a presentation, if you recall, on lighting and regulations around that. And then COID, property sale. And there was already some information that Cassie sent on that as well, as you know, in its current state. So if there's anything outside of this list that you guys feel should be added that we use to consider down the road as an agenda item, please speak now. And remember, we're short on time, so I'll give you guys a minute to think about that. So far, things have been quiet. I would like to say here, I believe between last month and our just recent discussion on the community email situation, that topic seems to be pretty closed up right now, other than the fact that we need to adjust our website language to better accommodate our community, to let them understand how to connect to us and what those steps are for accessibility. So I think beyond that, that one's probably one that we can kind of archive at this point or put as a completed. Last call. Okay, I'm going to call it, and we're right on time to move on to the next conversation. Thank you all.
Awesome. So there's been a lot of hard work in between meetings, and since our last full committee meeting, there were publicly available subgroup meetings where we were able to prioritize our actions in each of the 4 subgroups. And so how we're going to start the conversation going forward is in 2 steps. The first is going to be a report out from each of those 4 subgroups, talking about taking 10 minutes apiece to talk about the prioritization, what you ended up with on top, and any main notes or observations about kind of asterisks next to that. I know in committees there's a little bit of everyone did it slightly differently. So right now we have that listed for Kelly, Kersey, Bill, and Mark to do those report outs for about 10 minutes. And then we'll actually jump into the discussion of how we take that and prioritize for council, and Serena and Cassie have a proposal for us to start with going forward from there. So is there, of the 4 subgroup leaders, is there anybody that is looking or would be interested in reporting out first? Or it's all on the agenda. So why don't we start with Kelly? I can't see anybody's faces anymore. And is that lined up right, Kelly? Were you the leader of the energy supply group?
No, I didn't.
Oh.
We didn't do it in any order. I just did
Okay.
it. This is just an order of the CCAP, or we can do, oh, this is supposed to say waste and materials. Or we can do Kelly up first.
Okay. This is the waste and materials slide. So does that work, Kelly?
Yeah, that works great.
Great.
Okay, so I'm going to briefly describe just the approach that we took, and then the 3 of us actually will be handing off on different topics. So there are 3 of us that are in this subgroup. We each owned 2 actions, and we are responsible for researching our topics and providing an overview presentation to the rest of the subgroup. We discussed some of the opportunities and challenges with each action so that we felt we were all informed in making the decisions and rankings. We then individually ranked the action items, factoring in both priorities and constraints. I'm going to hand it to Kavi, who's going to talk about why this subgroup is important in the overall CCAP.
Thanks, Kelly. So I just want to note that waste and materials is uniquely important because it is one of the most visible areas of the CCAP. So although it may be noted to have a lower overall emissions impact, it has significant opportunities to shift the culture around the production, consumption, and disposal of materials that can lead to increased policy support for overall sustainability in the city. So it presents the best opportunity to balance top-down policy changes, which many of the other sectors and actions have, with bottom-up change from the community as a whole. There's also, I'll just also mention, there's also the inherent equity impact, where all residents should have equal access to recycling, composting, and information on reducing their consumption. The other equity impact is related to landfills as well. And lastly, I just want to note one stat that I got is that the recovery of materials in Oregon in 2016 reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 4.7% of statewide emissions, which is the equivalent of 690,000 average cars. And then I'll pass it on to, I think, Serena, who is going to cover our decided priority number 1.
Yeah, so thank you guys. Priority number 1 is interesting, and I think we may be the only group that kind of did this, and I'll tell you why. So the first 3 that you see there listed as our 1, 2, 3 are actually they're a combination of priority 1, and that may seem intensive, but the reason why we bundled between those 3 items, and I'll just read them quick: develop and deliver educational programs that encourage residents to compost their food waste, conduct outreach campaigns that promote food waste prevention, and expand curbside composting program. Between the time that the CCAP created these and today, the current state of things, curbside composting was a pilot program at the time. It is now rolled out throughout our waste haulers as an option. So that technically, I wouldn't say is completed, but it has expanded. So the idea here now is that kind of is more of a educational and communication platform to help expand it where people aren't currently using the program that exists. So the reason we're realizing that this is more of a food waste life cycle where, what you buy, how much you buy, and then how much you use, and then how much you waste and how you waste it is this overall culture shift and life cycle of food in itself. And it made sense for us as a team in our research and the current state of things within the city of Bend to bundle those together as a life cycle story for food. So ideally, a lot of these programs, again, are already in play with programs through the Environmental Center and our waste haulers. So we're asking to work with the community partners to develop a holistic educational campaign around this food waste or this food life cycle story. Make it fact and data driven, focusing on the impact that one can make in their own household. There's a lot of money that can be saved. I won't go through the data and facts right this minute, but there's a lot of money that can be saved in just a household on reducing and understanding your impact on food waste and food purchasing. So that in itself can be beneficial, obviously, by household, by person. So that's one of the importance of these actions. And as Covey said, it is not limited to one particular group of people. Everyone can benefit from this. It's fairly low-hanging fruit with a true cultural shift and opportunity. And just to note, 25% of landfill is food waste. So we have a lot of opportunity here to make a change. So I'm gonna push this over to Kelly to do priority number 2 really quickly, and we'll go on to the next step.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so the next one is utilize low carbon concrete mixes in city projects and create incentives to encourage developers to utilize low carbon concrete. So the actions we'd propose potentially a sidewalk pilot, which is similar to what the city of Portland completed back in 2015, 2016. They used 30 to 50% slag. The importance of this action is really that around the larger infrastructure development. Concrete generates approximately 887,000 million metric tons of greenhouse gases in 2015. It's the equivalent emissions from 190,000 passenger vehicles on the road for a year. It's one of the most intensive GHG materials typically used in city projects. And according to the EPA, the cement sector is the 3rd largest industrial source of pollution, emitting more than 500,000 tons per year of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and carbon monoxide. Concrete producers are knowledgeable of material and methods that can achieve up to 40% reduction in carbon. The findings from the existing studies, again, in the state of Oregon, so these have been proven out, is that low carbon concrete, it met the performance specs. They were cost neutral or less expensive than recipes most commonly used, and they performed well in post-project visual inspections. The main difference between 100% cement and lower carbon mixins was the early strength gain, although all mixes achieve the specific compressive strength by day 14, which is well ahead of the day 28 specification. It reduced the carbon footprint of an average sidewalk ramp by 23 to 34%. And once it's proven effective, the use of low carbon concrete could expand to other municipal projects. Kavi.
Thanks. And for our 3rd priority in terms of what we ranked it, and this was based on both the score, the kind of net score in terms of the impact it can have and also the constraints, but it was improving recycling at multifamily residences. So this is another large action on the food and on the waste and material side. So the actions that are listed in CCAP is creating codes, standards, and specifications to ensure multifamily developments optimized for recycling infrastructure, to conduct outreach and education to improve recycling in multifamily housing, and to coordinate with the Deschutes County and waste haulers to ensure that the programs developed can be standardized across the region. The importance of the action is that the goal that is noted in CCAP is to receive 45% non-food material recovery by 2025. So the reason this is another priority is that if we want to try and still hit that target, we do have to get started early. This action will play a significant role in reaching that target. This could also be combined with expanding composting to multifamily residences, which was not specifically mentioned as CCAP, but that's something else that also kind of came up during our discussion. And then lastly, I just want to mention that the Environmental Center, their Rethink Waste program actually did a pilot project at Summit Park Apartments. They did find that one of the main issues was contamination. So there is some information that we can learn from that as well that can really help try to get this pushed out on a larger scale at the city level. And then I think I'm passing back to you, Kelly.
So those are our top 3 bundled critical actions. The remaining actions we felt were also critical, but given sort of the time constraints, time and resource constraints we anticipate over the coming years, we focused on those. The others may be lower resource requirements or quite the opposite. In some cases, there's development with the county or with the state. And so we felt quite confident that these top 3 actions were those that the ECC could address, prioritize, and maintain within our time frame. So I think we will open up to questions and answers. I'm not sure if how we're doing on time limit.
Yeah, we're pretty good on time. So I think, I guess if the chairs, if you agree, we can maybe have a couple minutes for like questions. Does that sound good?
Yeah. Well, it's top of mind. We can do a couple minutes of questions. And I can't see everyone's faces, so raise your Zoom hand, and we'll do probably a couple questions.
Just a point of order on that. I think maybe those questions should be clarifying questions at this point rather than discussion.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Bill. Was that the question that Peter was going to have? I saw another hand. No. Well, it doesn't look like we have any clarifying questions. Can you all remind me what the proposal is for what the further expansion of the curbside composting program is, or is that using the education in steps 1 and 2 as that expansion? And I see Cubby's hand up, so maybe I don't know if you can answer or if you have an additional point of order.
Sure, I can try to answer it, but I also want to let Serena and Kelly answer any additional if they have any other additional information. So I think we discussed that, and part of it is, I think, like I mentioned, we did talk about maybe additional materials that could be included in composting, but we know that some of the materials that may not have as much of an impact. So in terms of compostable foodware or things like that, which I think the Oregon DEQ had done a study on it and had kind of concluded that there was a benefit to doing that, if I'm representing that accurately. But we did also talk about as part of providing recycling at multifamily residences, also having composting be part of that potentially. So that's not necessarily noted in the CCAP again, but maybe that's something as a committee, if everyone agrees that it makes sense that as we try to expand recycling at multifamily residences, we can also include composting, and that might be easily done infrastructure-wise or logistics-wise in terms of code changes or anything else like that. So I did want to note that. Does that help answer your question, Neil?
Yeah, that's great. And did you have, I saw your hand raised, did you have another comment before we move on to the next section?
Yeah, if we still have the time, I was going to pose a couple questions that might be helpful in terms of clarifying as well. So one of the things I just wanted to note in terms of data, again, in terms of this, is that currently Bend alone is producing approximately 143,000 tons of waste, which is just a little shy of what the entire county produced in 2018. And some of the questions is just with this increase in waste, will the Deschutes County be filling landfills even faster? What's the impact on the land associated with new landfills? What are the equity issues associated with where the site for a new landfill will be, and which communities the greenhouse gas emissions from garbage trucks and methane will affect? And also, even as Deschutes County strives to recover 45% of materials, what are the greenhouse gas emissions of transporting recyclables out of the county as well? So just some of the questions to consider for the whole committee as well.
Wonderful. Well, we can jump over to the next, just trying to make sure that we can get through all of this and have some robust discussion. If you have other ideas, especially since by the time we're done with our fourth one, we'll be 40 minutes from when the first point got brought up. Keeping notes might be a good idea. So we'll jump over to the next section, transportation, and Kersey, if you are able to unmute and talk through this, and I can jump in if there's any connection problems.
Thank you. Yeah, I might need some help. I can kind of see the screen we're sharing, but yeah, might need some support there. So there were 5 members working on this criteria and these action items. Worked through a lot of different points on this. We ultimately all aligned very closely on the order of these action items. Didn't have too much debate, have shifted things around, but ultimately, especially the top 3, strongly agreed that these were our priorities. So starting with the first one, we talked a lot through how prioritizing bike, pedestrian, complete streets is a part of the TSP, but wanting to show the council that this is our top priority under transportation, and wanting to see some additional financial support and prioritizing when and wanting to see this move quickly within the TSP. So that was kind of there. We didn't have to discuss it a whole lot because we all agreed that this needs to happen immediately or as quickly as possible. The second one, expand transit service consistent with the regional transportation master plan. This is already on its way. It is happening. There is a lot of support and a lot of low-hanging fruit here. We see that it's able to move forward and we want to support that. This also supports transit and the ability to move that along and support a big culture shift that goes along with number 3, create a mobility hub program. So combining these really shows our transit system that we're able to offer everything, and I think that is what will lead to a culture shift, which is ultimately what you need with transportation, is people feeling encouraged and able to, and there's the infrastructure to support different means of transportation. Neil, can you hop in on the electric vehicle readiness plan?
Yeah, so this is, we're kind of jumping back a step to where we had strategies and actions. This is an interesting one, and it was something that we wrestled with as a group. The strategy is promote, I don't know the exact language of it, but it's essentially promoting and advancing accelerating the adoption of electric vehicles. And then there was only one action, and I think that this was intentional, that this action was to start with a plan to identify where the opportunities for future actions would be. So this, because of that, and from kind of a history of other partially completed projects with the city, this is something that's already, like a lot of these things, is already planning on happening, and there's existing budget to work on this plan. As a part of this is where there's a significant opportunity. I think as a group, we recognize that the real main kind of big picture thing with transportation is transportation accounts for over a third of Bend's direct carbon emissions, and increasing bicycling, walking, and transit. So reducing the amount that we have to drive and then increasing the amount of miles that are being driven as being electric miles are kind of the way that we do that, and our actions are reflected there. So we didn't rank this as high because there aren't as many tangible actions, although we expect that plan to come up with some tangible actions that we might need to be considering in a shorter time period, or will hopefully be considering in this biennium, because there's very little that's been done up until this point. Does that sit right, Kirsty?
Yes, thank you. Okay. And then with 6 and 7, we played around with moving these around, ultimately knowing that the first 3 are what will matter most in our current budget, but knowing that Commute Options is a great partner for both of these, wanting to see those partnerships continue, and that the infrastructure pieces of these are also supported. I think with a lot of community support and the partnerships and collaboration, both of these can move forward with low resources. So hoping that these can remain a part of the conversation, move forward with ride sharing. The programs exist, and needing to see the city really support those and add additional incentives to make that easy and accessible. And then coordinating with the school district. There are conversations around this happening, and we do support this moving forward, even though it's lower on the list. Really see this as the way to shift how our youth use transportation, and as they become adults in our community, that if they're starting to use public transit in high school, that as we're increasing the ability to use transit over the next few years, that as they become adults and are working in Bend, that they're used to using transit already. So there are a lot of benefits there moving forward, especially with equity as well. There are a lot of gaps in our transportation system where people and students are being left out. And so this can cover a lot of that gray area. And then with number 8, there is, Cassie was explaining to us that because there is a system already working to replace city vehicles with electric vehicles, that we support that moving forward. We would like to see criteria added in here beyond cost, and really looking at all the other benefits. Given that city vehicles have low mileage use, and there is a system in place, we support that moving forward, and want to see that continue. So that's not a whole lot of change being needed for that action item. And so I'll open that up for any questions or comments.
Kavi, do you want to go first, and then Mark?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I don't know if I missed it, but was number 5 mentioned?
Let's see. Create high capacity transit corridors. I was sharing about this. I think those are happening. Let's see. Sorry. Does anyone else from the committee remember what we discussed on this?
I'm happy to jump in on that one, Chrissy.
Thank you.
So yeah, you said they're already happening, and what we heard from CET is that their main east-west and north-south routes, they have recently secured resources to double the basically reduce by half the headways. So it used to be that a bus would come every 30 minutes. It's about to be that a bus comes every 15 minutes at every stop. So basically they bought 2 new buses for each of those north, south, and east, west lines. So 3rd Street and Greenwood, Newport, which is a big change, and I think goes a long way towards creating high capacity transit corridors. So in a sense, it's already happening, but we had some discussion on our transportation subgroup about what it means as far as the city creating a high capacity transit corridor, and basically like for that corridor to be actually high capacity and that lots of people are using it. Are there land use or development changes on those corridors that are needed to actually make them high capacity? So that's one where I think it's another memo in our packet today where we talked about like needing a little more information to know exactly what that one means, or to study it more. But I think as a subgroup, we agreed it's important and that it's in one sense already happening. So that's kind of why we put it right in the middle of our priorities.
I'll also make one other quick comment that Rory, in conversations with Cascades East Transit, they made the connection that the most valuable thing in the city and community's role that they can do is improving bicycle, pedestrian, and complete streets. and that would support transit more than anything else in making those connections easier, safer, and providing more people the easy ability to connect and use transit and multimodal options. So that was a big consideration. Mark, do you have a quick clarifying question?
Yeah, and on that exact one, I'm curious how well developed that plan is. What is the status of that, the number one item, the bikes, pedestrian, complete streets? Just curious how specific of actionable items are there, and where is the city currently, do we know, on that process?
I can maybe try to answer that since it's a safe plan. I mean, the policies in the document, the TSP is very, very well defined, specific, because it was part of that whole TSP process that we just took a couple of years to complete. And in the TSP, there's a bunch of sections of policies, and one of them is about bike, pedestrian, complete streets, and it has a bunch of like, the city shall adopt a policy that this is the new standard type of thing, like that we will do complete streets for all new roadway construction projects. There's like policies in there. And then in some cases, there's specific actions like update code standards and specifications to make sure that this policy is actually implemented in the engineering process or the design process, that kind of thing. So those are quite fleshed out. And so in the CCAP, like the kind of stance was like, make sure that we're, you know, there's a lot of stuff in the TSP. And so it could look really different. The next 10 years could look really different depending on kind of what is prioritized as far as implementation, which part of it is part of that is defined by the bond, but not everything is covered by the bond because the bond is capital projects. A lot of the policies were more like new programs and that type of thing that should be developed in order to make pedestrian travel and bike travel safer. So that's kind of what it's saying is like, those are the things that should be prioritized as we work through implementing the TSP.
Thanks, Cassie. That's what I was wondering, if you think that for the council to act on that particular action, if there's any more detail that our committee would need to help provide or focus or priority, or if it really is standalone enough of an item that it doesn't need much extra work. And I'm thinking on some of ours in the energy supply, where clearly to act on it, you need a little bit more specificity still.
So yeah, that's something that we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit, but a lot of these will need more specificity for this one, partially because it is something we have a whole, transportation department and many departments that kind of work on deploying the transportation plan. And so we'd probably want to check in with that department and figure out exactly, like what the stance is today, where there are any gaps. It's different than some of the energy ones where the energy ones are areas where we don't have it's not areas of existing work for the city. So we'll kind of talk about how we plan on separating those as we move forward for the council, which wasn't included in the memo because it's something I've just been thinking about over the last week. So yes, some of them will need to be defined more. This one in particular, we would need to pull the transportation staff in to know exactly how to define that. Other ones like an energy supply and both of the energy ones, and also in some cases in waste and materials, no one's working on them. So they do need a lot more definition that the committee will have to work through. So we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the next discussion today.
Can I offer one more thing in response to Mark's question?
Yeah.
So I talked to city staff about that one, and they reminded me that in the TSP, that there's capital projects, which the bond measure funds part of, but then there's a lot of programs and policies. And Cassie mentioned this, but just to go a little further, they reminded me that in the formation of the TSP, they also studied funding sources to implement the thing. And the bond measure was the main funding source for capital projects, but for a lot of those programs, they identified the need for an additional funding source to do not one big capital project, but ongoing implementation of the programs. And I think the best example of that is the pedestrian, so basically a citywide sidewalk infill program, and that we need ongoing funding to actually build out the sidewalk network that's called for in the TSP. So that's, I think, like an actionable request that we could make of council is to find that funding source for those programs.
All right, let's jump. We're gonna have plenty of time to discuss. Let's jump on to the next group so we can hear their overview. So energy and buildings, that is Bill's up for this one.
Okay, and I'll probably, if I'm need a little help, I may ask you, Neil, or Peter to jump in. So I think overall in this one, we had to think about how a lot of these actions happen in the private sector and within the community partners sector. So we had to think about what things the city can do. Where does the city have leverage in these actions? And so I think we had some different prioritizations in as far as the criteria go. But in general, we thought about how much can a city have influence on it? How much effort is it going to take to implement the action? Is it duplicating other efforts? And how much is the actual reduction potential for each of the actions? So, of course, the city, one big place the city has an ability to do something is as buildings are going through the code process. So that was important. And another piece is just getting energy efficiency in buildings into the decision-making process, augmenting the existing energy efficiency programs. And we felt there was maybe a lack of knowledge of some of the building science practices, maybe especially in the trades. And we also noted, like waste, that some of the actions in here are related to other actions and may even be able to be somewhat like, I'll address it as I get into the specifics. But when you look at the first two, the first two, they're very different, but when we were discussing them, it started out maybe the code update process was our number one choice, but that was when we were making the prioritizations individually. And during that time, there was a legislative bill that was in the works, and it looked like maybe it was going to pass to allow individual cities in Oregon to adopt the REACH code. And the REACH code is a code, for those who maybe don't know, it's a kind of a forward-thinking code that comes up, it is about 10% less energy or 10% more efficient than the existing code. And the bill was trying to allow cities to adopt that, and it would be standardized amongst those cities, and it got all the way through to the Ways and Means Committee, and as the session wore down, there was a last minute objection, I think, into Ways and Means, and it didn't make it through the adjournment of the session. So that kind of changed our thinking about what the city could do in terms of the code update. That would have provided a very easy way for the city, and the city did support this bill, so it would have made a much easier process to update codes and adopt. If we had just said, okay, the council should tell the city to adopt the REACH code, and so to do it now, since it's done at the state level, it's a little more challenging to get involved in the code process, but we really felt like it's really important because, and I'm talking about the second one first, but it kind of sets a baseline, it sets a floor for efficiency in the energy code, and without trying to advance it's conservative by nature, the codes and changing them, and the building science gets ahead of the code process, and the code the folks in the code, in the permit office have lots on their plates, and they're trying to keep up with with what's going on in there's so many houses being built and remodeled that they have a hard time keeping up. And maybe in this, some things that can be done are to try to get someone maybe to be a champion for energy efficiency in the code division. So anyway, we felt that one is important, but because that changed in the middle of the whole prioritization process, we moved the incentive packages to create new incentive packages to the first. And one of the things we noticed is that, well, in that space, there's also, you've got Energy Trust and Central Electric, and then there's some federal and state tax credits that are already existing out there. And so one of the things that would have to be done is to try to look for the gaps and things that the city can actually get involved in to increase the installation of energy efficiency projects. There's some slim margins out there in the building profession and trying to get houses built, and things that if they're good incentives, they can actually make a difference. And so I think it's the challenge in this one will be trying to identify where the city can have an impact and try to make things that augment what are already existing. So we looked at, the third, fourth, third and fourth ones, and maybe even the seventh ones sort of fit within that creating new incentives. A home energy score program it's an independent action, but a piece of that, we felt that one was pretty important because there's not really a way within the existing home and business, this one's homes, but in the existing homes, to know the difference between an energy efficient home and one that isn't. There's really no way to identify it. I mean, person could ask for utility bills, and if the owner decides to let them be released from the utility, they might have a sense of what the utility usage is, but there's no simple way. And there have been home energy score programs in other cities, and they work, and they're a way to compare homes, and we felt that's pretty important. And then revolving loans, we have that one as a fairly high priority because they exist out there, and the ones that we've looked at, they're fairly effective. One of the problems is people don't have a lot of new energy projects, both in commercial and residential, require a capital investment. And there may be a very good project that doesn't happen in a home or business because they don't have the money to do it up front, to pay the upfront costs. And so this one is fairly, there's lots of models out there to do it. It's not low admin cost, but it could be moved to a third party and probably would be. But this one's fairly effective, and we think it could get some projects off top dead center. In our discussion, we also thought about what's happening in the workforce and how do you deliver energy? How do you make an efficient home if the people designing it and building it are not up on the most current building science? And so we don't think it's being disseminated really well. One of the things that seems to happen in, for example, the trades, in the trades, it's often an apprenticeship program, or it's people learning from someone who they learn from by following someone else's example. So it's somewhat of a historical way. You learn the way it was done. and there's, you know, there's some need for, there's a shortage of people in the building trades right now. So there's not good ways right now to get people up to speed in the most current practices in buildings. And if you don't have that, you're just not, you're fighting history in a way. So, and there are some programs out there, and that, like the Energy Trust and some other organizations have trainings, but they seem to be addressing a fairly small audience, and sometimes it's the people who already know a little bit about it. So we feel like we're not reaching everyone, that's something that maybe the city could coordinate and help trying to get people better trained in the way we need to be building buildings.
Hey, Bill, we're over 10 minutes, so if you could just wrap up in the next minute or two.
Wow, I thought it was going on like 5. Okay, so then the supporting, I already mentioned the low-cost energy audit programs is somewhat a piece of the first one as well. We felt that one is something that couldn't be done because it's helpful, because it's going to that's something that's people with limited incomes could participate in, and so that's going to help move things forward. The other ones, that's 8, 9, and even 10, are kind of augmenting what's going on already. And I think I missed one. Oh, I missed them on develop incentives to encourage smaller housing options. That was, we moved that one up from actually almost the last to number 6, and we brought that one way up because we felt there's been the new zoning decisions have actually enabled the ability to have smaller options, but what's missing is some incentives to try to encourage people to build smaller houses. And that one also goes out and it helps waste, and it's also going to augment the energy in the energy supply that uses less energy. The last ones, I'll just kind of jump over them.
I do think we need to wrap up this one up. And so I think it's okay if we don't talk through each of them. Yeah.
Okay.
So that we have a minute for clarifying questions from the group.
All right, we'll take that gap in questions to jump on to the next one, energy supply with Mark Buckley.
Great, thanks, Neil. I'll jump right in, try to be quick on this. We had a nice committee with Bill, Peter, and Kelly, where all of them had a variety of expertise and practice on these topics from the utility industry side. So we were able to walk through and had sort of a similar process to what others have described, where we each did our research. And then I'll say that when we did our scoring, we tried to build it up from the criteria, the priorities that we discussed, and especially the strong nexus here on actual CO2 emissions from energy supply. We saw that as our real focus on this group. And I'm going to jump right in at number 1. This concept of getting to 100% renewable supply, something we all saw is very important. We saw different levels of constraint on what the city could actually do, although Cassie let us know that there is quite a bit that the city can incrementally do. So we did see that it would be important to keep that at the top of the list, even though it feels like more of an umbrella strategy that touches or could encompass several of the others. So while we want to send the signal of its importance, we know there probably aren't as actionable of items under that, but as opportunities arise with the utilities, for example, or if new mechanisms come up, we do want to make sure we're sending that signal. It's particularly with the state, House and Senate recently passing Bill 2021 to move the state to 100% renewable. Hasn't been signed yet by the governor, but she's already made statements in strong support. So I'm sure we're headed there. which would get us to, I've got the details here, 80% below baseline emission levels by 2030, 90% below by 2035, and to a full 100% renewable by 2040. So the state is already going to keep us moving on that path. So in terms of actionable individual items, we don't see as much urgency there right now. Collectively across the rest of the items, there's a lot of consistency with the themes we've heard from the other committees, and looking for sort of the low-hanging fruit, particularly around existing expenditures, private expenditures, even into city expenditures, and where we can nudge those investments towards the lower carbon options out there. So I'd say in general, we have decent consensus in our group, especially around the top and the bottom of this list. In the middle, so a little bit of discretion individually in terms of information and the value of providing more information to inform private decisions versus the actual incentives or even the loan funds that again are consistent with some of the energy and building kinds of questions, and it seems like transportation as well. So just walking through these a little bit, we saw that the need to make sure that we're taking advantage of existing incentives as much as possible that are already available and funded generally from outside the community, and then think about where there are important gaps in those incentives that the city might augment. And then even an extension of that is into the revolving loan fund type of structure, which again would need to be developed. I think one important part of these actions is to think about what the financial implications are. And so that was probably an important thread through here, that in the middle of the list, they probably sort of generally get more and more expensive from the city's perspective. And so higher up, it's more sort of informing and improving sort of the social efficiency of investments that are happening. And then as it moves forward, it gets into a little bit more of a cost burden. I will say at the bottom, we weren't necessarily opposed by any means to any of these actions, but we didn't see a lot of consistency with the offset for natural gas program with some of the priorities that we had and the real net consequence for carbon emissions. But there is certainly a lot of room for debate and discussion there. And we wouldn't say that we would try to oppose that, but it didn't seem like it rose very high. And the biodigester was an item that Kelly has had to dig into in the past. And folks have questions she might be able to answer, where it financially didn't make a lot of sense, but we recognize socially some of the co-benefits and carbon benefits might justify, especially if there's outside grants and funding that the city is able to receive. So even though it's at the bottom of the list, again, there isn't explicit opposition by any means, but didn't see a need for a strong push. So our group didn't exactly come up with a tight little package in terms of what we would recommend moving forward. But especially looking across the other items and the energy and buildings in particular, the incentives, both existing and new and revolving loan funds, seems like a pretty consistent little set of priorities that would fit in well with some of the priorities of the other groups. Kelly, Peter, Bill, is there anything any of you would like to add to this? Any important points I might have missed?
I think you got it.
Okay, yeah, probably going a little faster than we need, but I figure maybe we can make up a little time. And I think ours is pretty simple. It kind of overlaps with the others. Maybe the last thing would be, and this sort of was some of the instigation behind my question on transportation, is that developing the roadmap from the city's perspective. Again, we can be as supportive as possible with ongoing efforts, but there probably aren't real actionable items. And I don't know, Cassie, if there's anything else you'd want to say about what that first one means. I guess I should also say that we clarified that is a focus on grid supplied electricity. So a little bit of refinement there that narrows it a bit, but still is pretty wide ranging.
That was the only thing I was going to add, is that the intent of that strategy was about grid supplied electricity, because the rest of the actions in the energy supply category kind of get at the non-grid supplied, like the distributed renewable energy potential in the community. So the one kind of potential actionable item that I see under that is trying to move forward with a local community green tariff, which was enabled through House Bill 2021. So that is, that would be a bigger discussion that we would get into. I suspect not everyone is super familiar with that, but there is kind of one actionable item under that that could be pursued to move a lot quicker than the state's progression to 100% renewable.
And that community green tariff, you do feel, Cassie, that that's consistent enough with the priority that as the council has already sort of approved and moved forward with the CCAP, that wouldn't need to be a new, just sort of clarifying, I think what you're saying, that wouldn't need to be a whole new action.
No, because the community green tariff was kind of the concept we were envisioning in the development of the CCAP. So that was discussed a lot. The shape of it was kind of morphing, but it was that idea that like at a community scale, we could work with the utility to provide 100% renewable electricity to Bend. They need to be educated on it a lot as well. And it was a different council. So yeah.
Okay, so that would be an action that would accelerate, as I mentioned, already at the state level, we're talking about getting 80% there by 2030 and 100% there by 2040. So it's probably an idea in terms of, do we want to try to accelerate the city's progress on that trajectory? But with that, maybe I'll stop and see if there's any clarifying questions.
I have a question. I think this might live somewhere in between energy supply and energy in buildings. But with the conversations of 100% renewable energy supply, that's talking about grid electricity. I'm wondering if I know why it's not on this list, but I'm wondering if conversations about electrifying buildings or stopping connections to natural gas for new buildings, if that was just enough in between both categories of why, if that came up in conversation, since you all talked about natural gas in that group.
Well, I would say that for this list, it wasn't really within the purview of any of the groups to like add something about not having natural gas. So it wasn't in the CCAP originally, but there was discussion of it. So some committee members can feel free to chime in. But as far as like why it's not on this list, it wasn't like they had the ability to like specifically add something about that.
I've got my hand up.
Yeah, but I thought you were going to respond to that, Bill. Were you?
I just was trying to be orderly. No, I think it's a good point. I was actually going to mention the same thing. We didn't address natural gas except for the offset, and the reason that's low is there's a lot of uncertainty about how effective the offsets are. It wasn't in the CCAP. So we weren't in the mode to create new actions, but clearly both in energy supply and energy in buildings, you have to address natural gas in some way because it isn't renewable and it does have a greenhouse gas contribution that has to be addressed. So I'm not sure how we move forward as this committee moves forward, but at some point we really do have to figure out how to address natural gas. And you mentioned one.
I think we're sorry. I think we are implicitly addressing a little bit, Bill, by putting the offset so low that we aren't trying to encourage development and investment in ways that might perpetuate capital investment on that front. But we recognize we're not going to retrofit everyone's homes, so it's not going to be a quick change, and we haven't proposed any actions that involve widespread retrofits.
And I recognize that might have been a little bit of a derailing comment, in that I think there's a lot of things that this is a mostly separate group of the people that created the original list, and represents different parts of our community and doesn't represent different parts of, or, you know, it's a different world. So I think it's right to work within the existing bounds that we have and then continue to investigate and make additional suggestions as time goes on. And I also want to recognize that we are very over time for this section since we included those clarifying moments. So it was there's a lot of actions and a lot of work that went into this. And so I guess I'll pass off to Serena and Cassie to talk about our next steps so we can really figure out how this actually gets bundled and move when we can move on to prioritizing for council.
Thank you, Neil. Yes, so we've done as a group, as individuals, as subgroups, a lot of work. And obviously there's still a lot more to do. But the exciting part is, you know, we've been able to take a lot of information and narrow it down into some semblance of, hey, here's where we should start focusing, right? So the next question is, how do we actually take this information that we just learned today and talked about over these last few months and actually prioritize it for council? And I'm gonna hand it over to Cassie here in a minute, but we need to really determine which actions council is able to implement. There's a lot of work to be done. I know we're all anxious to like jump in and tackle as much as possible, but we have to be smart about what we're handing over. And so there's some prioritization thoughts and procedures that we're working towards. And I'm gonna hand it over to Cassie to talk through some of that, and then I'll chat more about the process.
Yeah, thanks, Serena. So I just wanted to kind of talk about the next steps a little bit, because we want to move forward, but just to give a little context around kind of like the decision that you all make about recommending to council, kind of what does that mean and where do we go from there? So as you all know, we need to select from all of the CCAP actions. We need to select a couple of them to recommend to the council that we move forward with this biennium. Particularly with this, we have $100,000 of budget to move forward with a couple of actions. There's two things going on. We have a few like existing actions that are already underway, primarily in the transportation group. That's where it's most prevalent. And so what needs to happen is that we need to select 3 to 6 like new action CCAP items to recommend moving forward with. So those would be things outside of the ones that are kind of already underway. The memo I wrote was kind of just giving some considerations for picking those new action items. When selecting those, kind of some big things to keep in mind is one, whatever those new action items are, we need to consider that stemming from those will be a work plan for the committee. So there is the pieces about, okay, the council and the city staff are going to have to move forward with these things, but you all as committee members are also going to have to work through those new actions, which is just a good reminder when we think about like what is reasonable to try to accomplish in a 2-year period that's already, the clock has already started on. Because as we've talked about, a lot of the items have details to be worked out still. Like we still need to figure out what the specific action items are. We need to weigh the costs and benefits of those action items, figure out what a budget would be to allocate to that action item. And so that is actually going to be the work of the committee with the staff. I mean, it will be something where, staff will kind of come up with proposals and work through the committee, but that's a big piece of what comes next, is that you all as a group will actually work through the details. But another thing is that a lot of committee members have acknowledged through this prioritization process that to even select those 3 to 6 new actions, like it feels a little tricky because we don't have all of those details yet. And so we're not sure if we want to move forward with this one or that one until we know all those details. But what I think we need to be comfortable with is just picking a couple of them that based on the information that we have, that we think are the most important, because we'll get to those details later. We don't have the ability with our time to get to all those details with all 42 actions. So we need to narrow that now. And if something comes up, like if something was a top priority for you all, and then as we look into the details, it's like, actually, that's not panning out the way we thought, we can shift gears and select a new thing. So it's kind of like pick the top 3 to 6 we want to work on now with the best information we have. We're committing to working through those things for over the next, year or two in committee meetings. And that's what we have to pick. And then simultaneously, we will, for those existing actions that are at the top, we'll still be able to communicate to the council that these are also top priorities for the ECC and for the climate action plan. But the nice thing about those is that we don't necessarily need to factor those into our work plan or our budget availability because they're occurring elsewhere. So how I would propose we move forward with the actual selection process, and this was like we're open to, I think the discussion we want to have after this little intro is if this process works for you all, or if there's other things we need to consider when we're picking these. But I was thinking we could just do like a pretty simple sticky exercise. Like if we were in person, I'd put it up on whiteboards. And I was thinking about doing the top half of each of the subgroup actions, putting them on a virtual whiteboard, and having people will have 5 stickies each, and they'll get to say, I like this one, I like this one, I like this one, for 5 of them. And then we'll see what the top ones are. And we could do that kind of earlier in the process so that we have time to discuss afterwards. And that way we can do a little bit of that reconciliation like we did for the evaluation meetings. Because I know that you put the stickies down and sometimes they don't look exactly how you want. So you always want the opportunity to talk those through. And I was thinking we could kind of just choose that way. So I was thinking we could do that actually at the next meeting in August, because we have all the information report outs from everyone. You all have another month before then to do additional research or talk to each other about some of that info. So that's my proposed how we move forward process. And I didn't have a chance to talk about that with the chair, so definitely interested in hearing everyone's feedback on that, if you think there's anything missing. And then really quick, because we had some questions about like, what are the council recommendations? How much detail do we need to provide? So I'm hoping we can present to the city council in September. And what would happen at that meeting is, this is kind of an outline of the presentation. I would give a short CCAP overview. I'd share some context with them about kind of how we got to the recommendations today and what the implications of those recommendations will be. And then we would have the chair and vice chair share the 3 to 6 new action items. And one thing that I think the council, we're really going to need to include is describe any equity considerations that need to be integrated for those actions, because the council is very interested in making sure we're centering equity. So that's something I can help with, because we actually have that detailed for most of them already. And then we would outline the next steps in the work plan for each of the actions, for what would the council need to do, what would the staff need to do, and what would the committee need to do. And that's stuff that I'll help define for you all. But that would be the presentation of the council. Like, this is what we're proposing moving forward for. And then the second part of the presentation would be, these are the other actions that are already underway or planned. They're moving forward, but we want you to know that it's really important to us that the council and the city continue moving forward with those items. So that could be some of those transportation items. Or if there's any additional considerations you want to like add about those existing action items. And then we would get, we'd have time for discussion with the council, and we get their feedback on those priorities. And the goal is to have at the end their approval of moving forward with those priorities. So they're saying, okay, yep, we want you to work on those things. We understand that you're going to come back to us when there's key council decisions that need to be made. We understand that there's going to be, this is how the $100,000 that we allocated will be spent, will be at, across these things. So that's kind of what it will look like. That was helpful for me to think through. So I hope it's helpful for some people to kind of know that. So I've taken up a lot of the time already that I want us to have for discussion. So I'll give it back to Serena before we go on.
Thank you, Cassie. I hope that information was really helpful for everyone to at least frame up this discussion. We didn't want to come in and just have it super open-ended, especially with the time constraints that we have. We do have a couple things that we want to kind of finalize, potentially, and talk through today, at least, and come to a consensus on. And again, the timeline is that by August, we would finalize our votes for the top actions, and then between August and September we would collect that information to council. So we'd talk through that as well. Before I open it up, I just want to let you guys know there's a couple ways we can do this, but one of the things that we should maybe come to a consensus on before jumping too far in is understanding that there's 4 categories within the CCAP. You all know that. Do we want to try to focus and support having not necessarily an equal representation, but representation from each of those categories, or eliminate the categories in the sense that we don't necessarily care if all categories are represented in those top? I think that's a worthy discussion to at least think about before we get too far in this process, because I think that makes sense in terms of how we support and work through those actions. But I'm going to open it up to the floor and just take a couple minutes to let you guys speak what you're thinking with the information that Cassie and I have just brought forward to you, and then we'll go from there. So I'm opening up the floor right now for anyone to raise their hand and talk through what their thoughts are so far. And I need to open up my screen so I can see hands. Mark?
Just to clarify, are the new actions already identified, or is that part of our process too?
They're pretty much already identified. The only existing actions really were the transportation actions. Like the one about, the prioritizing the bike ped and complete streets, the transit ones, and then the EV plan.
So ideally, for the next meeting, we would have those colored or highlighted separately, so we can kind of maybe eliminate those necessarily from the voting process.
Yeah, that was my thought.
In a visual format, so we can better understand what that looks like. Neil?
I really like separating our support for existing programs versus new projects or programs. I think it's really important, and that was something that I know we struggled with in a lot of what we were doing, was if we've made progress on it or if it's happening and really important, we don't want to rank it low, but we also don't want to fill too much of the air with that. So I think it's important for them to hear from us because there's always every decision that's made, even with existing programs. It doesn't mean that it's being done perfectly. It doesn't mean that it's being done fast enough. And so I think it's important to recognize both categories, and I like that split, or I fully support splitting up those two things.
Great. Kavi?
I just had a quick question on that. So I know for our group, one of the actions was in relation to the infrastructure upgrade, which is the landfill, which was the lead was the county. Is that also kind of a similar kind of thing? I know we had talked about it briefly, Cassie, so I just want to see if that falls into a similar kind of, we support it, but we're not doing a lot of work behind it.
Yeah, it would be, since that one wasn't in the top half of actions. I'm not sure it would be included in the vote, but that would be as well.
Any other questions on just that overall conversation so far? If there aren't, I'll give us a second. If there aren't any, I'd like to address the category separation, how we're gonna, not that we're voting right now, but when we vote, do we want to make sure that we consider categories, or do we just vote like Cassie said, top 5, doesn't matter where the categories are, just these are, these are the ones, and then we identify from there. It kind of does make sense on how we move forward with that voting process and what that looks like. So I guess to open it up, is there anyone that feels strongly about having the categories represented? Bill? Oh,
Is
sorry.
that what you're asking? You're asking the question, should we try to get some action from across the board of all the different categories versus saying, I mean, theoretically, all 5 of our recommendations could be in one category if we aren't careful. I don't think they will be, but I guess I sort of think maybe let's see where it goes without trying to say, oh, we have to get 1 in each category and then maybe 2 others. If they all land in 1, we probably better rethink a little bit. But I think we can let it fall where it falls. But that's my opinion. It'd be nice if we could get a few in each one.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Kelly?
I think even if we don't have people from the individual subgroups or categories presenting, maybe just having one representative available to answer any specific questions that may come would be helpful.
Are you talking about at council?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
That does make sense. So what I'm hearing so far, Covey.
So I just wanted to kind of share. So I know we've been talking about having 3 to 6 kind of actions that we're going to prioritize, but I just want to kind of briefly share my thought that each action is obviously different in terms of how much of a time commitment it might be or how much of a constraint or resources might need. So just from our waste and materials, the low carbon concrete is a fairly, I think, small action that we can do very quickly, versus something like multifamily recycling is a much larger action. So I just being mindful of how we're maybe not putting the emphasis totally on just 3 to 6 actions, but also kind of determining the effort required for each of those actions too. I don't know the best way to do that, but coming up with some kind of idea of how much resources and time the actions would take to use that to prioritize the actions as well.
That's why I did a range of 3 to 6. That's a twofold range. So if they're huge actions, then I thought 3 was appropriate. And if they're kind of smaller, it'd be 6, but we can look at that list. And if there's one that's like, oh, this is a really straightforward one and add a 7th, then we can look at that. But I want to keep us realistic, like 7, 8, 9 actions in a 2-year biennium with $100,000 doesn't strike me as super realistic, which is kind of why I put the range that I did.
Mark?
It kind of relates to the question of existing versus new actions as well, and if there's a budget implication. Because one thing when I've done these before, sometimes if you emphasize an existing action, there might be opportunities to accelerate it, increase funding for it, things like that. I know, for example, when we were doing this for Puget Sound recovery, removing the Elwha Dam was something that was going to happen in 20, 30 years, but the Puget Sound Partnership was able to double the local funding and make it happen twice as fast. So I don't know if, say, for example, the Bikes Complete Streets, if there would be opportunities to accelerate it. If, Cassie, that could be sort of a hybrid option where there's ones where we're endorsing, but we don't see a need to allocate more funds. But if there's an opportunity to increase funding or effort, even sort of staff resource effort is the budget constraint, there's a way to help accelerate actions. It's kind of a question, kind of a comment, I guess.
That makes sense to me. What I was hoping we could do is if we can get the vote done by next month, by August, we can do I think the council presentation will still be after the September committee meeting. But that way, between August and September, I can work with the chairs or maybe a subset of the group to kind of articulate, like, here is the CCAP action, specify a little bit like, what is the action item or what do we mean by that, you know? Which is where we could differentiate between some of those things. Like, we think this should just continue having as planned, or we think this needs to be amplified. And then we can come back to the full committee in September with kind of that proposal before the meeting.
Peter?
So my thought on the prioritizing actions, I'm personally less concerned about equal representation from each category. More concerned with, in the next biennium, what can we realistically accomplish and make a difference by the actions that we bring to the top. So that's just my input on that question.
Thank you. Neil?
Yeah, I think similarly, I want, or kind of an additional comment. The CCAP was created in response to the city's climate action goal, which is a very well articulated carbon reduction goal, and scaling resources and projects to meet that goal, I think is what is my interpretation of what our committee is here to do. And so that was why we pushed for specific budget for this. But I think part of that is kind of to be seen as we evaluate going forward and have the ability to check in and see how we're doing over time. But part of our role can be saying, this seems like a lot, but we set this goal and it needs to be a lot. So that's just kind of outstanding in as a general comment. And then for the prioritizing particular actions, I think it's one component of many that we're considering. But we also have such, since we are being asked to prioritize a small number of actions with 4 categories that seemed more like neat boxes rather than identified. It didn't seem like it was part of our evaluation criteria to have each action, although there were other criteria that I would argue would weight a breadth of projects, because we weren't just looking at one thing. So as the things rise up, I would imagine that we would have a mix of projects just in my own mind. So I'm kind of curious to see how that goes going forward. But if we commit to one from every, and we can only have 3 big projects, then we've already excluded one.
That's a great point, Neil. And I'd like to maybe, Cassie, when we start our conversation in August, if we could just put a reminder, put a goal, what our goal is as a group up. So we just have that top of mind before we're actually, go through and vote and do that process. So again, just a refresher, obviously we all pretty much know what that is, but just as a visual reminder, being able to represent that. So we do keep on track with what our intent is as a group. Thank you, Neil. Tess?
Yeah, I think I agree with everybody that putting really strict boundaries on 1 per category is probably not the way to start it out. But when we kind of come to a natural selection, one of the things that we might want to keep in mind when reviewing those is whether it's strategic to think about how the top priorities bunch out, because the 4 categories do kind of align with different departments in the city, and whether that has any indication as to the capacity that's available to complete the projects or the funding and resources. If everything bunches up over transportation and the transportation department needs to be responsible for being the city partner on that might have further implications for funding and resources.
Very good points, Tess. Thank you. So what I'm hearing is we don't necessarily want to worry about the categories specifically to start. We're going to take all the actions, the top half of each category, put them together. We're all going to have 5 voting stickers virtually, I'm assuming, that we will be able to represent in a platform that we've used in the past to visually vote on what we feel is our top 5 individually in a group setting, in the public setting. And then as a group, we will talk through that based on all these considerations that we're thinking of. We have to remember too that as we Cassie kind of went through this, but as we kind of slim down those lists, we will identify to council what the current assumption is on that, who is responsible, who the partners may be in that action. So there's a lot more to disseminate from each of those. But I think as we're able to hone in, narrow the focus, we'll, as a group, be able to really have a well-rounded SMART goal list that we can achieve for the biennium that's currently in play. Any other thoughts on the process that obviously the process will be put into more detail between now and the next meeting, so you guys will feel comfortable in what we're expected to achieve. But Covey?
Yeah, I think the one thought I just had based on what you mentioned, it's not fully formed yet, but you mentioned, having like a top 5. And I think the thing I'm running into, and I know Bill had mentioned this in previous meetings, is there might be certain actions that might be very low-hanging fruit or small effort, or that other actions might be dependent on. And so I'm just concerned that if we're only doing the top 5 for each of us, we will end up choosing the top 5 biggest actions, and some of these smaller quick things that we could kind of get in motion will be delayed 2 years. So I was thinking, I don't know, not to complicate it too much, but I wonder if it makes sense to have kind of like a point bank where we each get 100 points, and then the action, depending on the effort or cost, could be rated a 5 or 10 point versus like a 30-point action. And then that way we're able to have a good mix of larger actions and maybe also choose some smaller actions to also prioritize. So I wanted to throw that idea out there and see what the group thought of doing something like that to get a good mix of actions.
Does anyone, Mark?
I certainly like that idea, and that's how I tend to think. I guess the question turns back to how hard would it be to allocate the costs for each of those. And I think Tessa's point about cost being staff specific are really important as well. So I know we had some cost estimates in there.
We have some generalities from the CCAP study.
It's pretty difficult. Honestly, I'll say it's pretty difficult, especially from the committee's perspective, to estimate accurately the relative effort, especially on staff resources. It also depends a little bit what each of the actions end up looking like. So we do have, but there's a scale. So I would think if we want to factor that in, maybe do it in a less kind of precise way. So it could be like big action, small action, as I think as specific as we'd want to get, rather than try to specify this one's a 30-point action. Ooh, this one's a 25-point action, because there's no way to know. It's kind of like big and small is about as far as I think we could reasonably go. So we can think about that when I talk with the chairs tomorrow, if it's like pretty easy to break them up into big and small, and maybe we can vote separately on those, or we can just vote and then do the reconciliation where we factor some of that stuff in. Because a lot of times you just get that stuff through the discussion too.
Well, if you do big and small, you could have where we get 6 points we can mark, and those big ones count as 2. Maybe that's what you're implying with the 3 to 6.
Yeah, I mean, we'll figure out. It's kind of hard to figure out the number system on the fly, but we can, we'll figure out a way of trying to break those up, because it's a good point.
Yeah. Rory, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, just similarly on the action matrix that Cassie put together for us, there's a low, medium, and high ranking for each action. So kind of like Mark was just saying, we could say like low, medium, high corresponds to 1, 2, 3, and everyone has like 8 points to use, right? So you could do 2 high and 1 medium, which would get to your 8 points, or you could do 4 medium and 2 low, something like that.
Great. So what I'm hearing is that we do want to at least understand when we're voting intensity of the action, whether it's in resources, cost, or time, in some way, shape, or form, which we don't have currently identified, but we will work to create some sort of system to allow for that type of consideration at voting. And I want to remind everyone too that this isn't going to be a perfect process. We're doing as much as we can with the information that we have. And it's been really great feedback from everyone on what we're looking to achieve. And we have to be comfortable with that kind of 60-40, 70-30 vote without knowing all the answers. I know that can be super hard. It's super hard for me. I like to be at 100% for a lot of things that I do, but in reality, we have to kind of move forward without knowing all of that. And everyone has their strengths, and everyone's doing an amazing job with the research and the information that they're putting forward. So I personally feel like it's going to be whatever we ultimately decide with the conversations that we've had to date and what we'll have in the future is going to be really robust and really well-rounded. Bill?
Well, I hope the discussion is where the prioritization process that with numeric kinds of things, as always, it gets you in the ballpark, and then you refine it with the discussion. And I hope the discussion is good and open, because the same, I mean, we found in the prioritization process in each group that things changed from what each of us thought to what all of us thought. Yeah. And so, and that happened in the discussion. And so if we can have a good, I think I like the idea of trying to somehow weight the effort required to do a different action, because I was also concerned a little about some easy things they won't make it because we think some other things are much more important. So I like that we're trying to figure out a way to include some things that we just like to get done, and the city could get done fairly easily, and also things that come up. Just how do you deal with those? How do you take advantage of those opportunities? You want that to happen too. So I think we'll get there. I like the process. I think the sticky thing is fine. If it's like a beer festival where one action requires 2 stickies, right? Versus 1, that's fine. But yeah, then you gotta refine it in the discussion.
Well, thank you for that, Bill. Yeah, we'll definitely obviously fine tune the actual actions and how we're going to prioritize specifically, but all of these comments have definitely been helpful in being able to better transform that process. I'm going to turn it over to Cassie. Is there anything other, I know we're almost out of time, so is there anything else we needed to address for that part of the conversation?
No, I think this has been really helpful. And yeah, I'm looking forward to us moving on at the next meeting.
Okay. Neil, you're up.
All right. We have a minute or so. If there's items that we want to add, that anybody wants to suggest either to add to next month's meeting or to put on the bike rack for a potential meeting. As a general note, I feel like I'm excited to see a lot more of that conversation in the following months, because I know that this is a key priority of getting this started, so we can start this work in this biennium. But are there other items that folks wanted to bring to the table? Covey, go ahead.
Real quick, I wanted to have the emergency declaration part of the bike rack to see if we can have that included when we present to City Council. So it doesn't have to be a discussion for next meeting, but just something, if we could talk about that before we present the recommendations to City Council.
I know you might not have the answer to this, but do you have an idea of how long you think that discussion might take for this group?
I think it should be fairly simple. The declaration language is available. So I think it would be probably 5 to 10 minutes, but depending on how strongly the group feels about it one way or the other.
So the decision about making a climate emergency declaration is distinct from the decision around the recommendations for the council. So I would not advise on combining those conversations, even just to manage the stewardship subcommittee discussion. just from a practical perspective, I don't think it makes sense to, and I also don't think we have enough, given the decisions we have to make before that discussion, I'm not sure there's enough time to discuss like the implications of the emergency declaration and put something together and all of that. So my recommendation would be to keep that as a separate discussion. And Mary, I saw you pop up. Do you have something to add?
Well, I guess I was just thinking, before you spend a lot of work and time on doing an emergency declaration, you might want to get direction, at least from the subcommittee, on whether they want you to work on it. And then you would look at models from other cities. But at least from the committee, get direction from them whether they want that on your work plan. Were you thinking of actually presenting one to them?
When you said the committee, did you mean city council?
Yeah. I thought you were going to the stewardship subcommittee first. Sometimes we use them just kind of as the sounding board on, is this a good idea? To get 3 counselors to say, yeah, we think so, whether it's a good idea for your time. That was kind of my thought process there, to get a read from them.
I'm not as familiar with that process, but I'm open to it. I thought it was going to be a low effort thing from my talks with the city of Milwaukee, where the declaration is pretty much already ready. And I think the city council will be supportive of that. And I know the city has already passed something similar in the past. Just the language is a little stronger on this one, and it's more of an international framework.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe they would be, but it's just that the subcommittee's nice because it's a more informal, like you can have back and forth, that you don't tend to have at council quite so much, so it can work well, that they can, ask questions and you can answer them, and you could just have more of a dialogue at the subcommittee level. So if that's coming
so I'm open
first.
to, and I don't want to take too much time, but I'm open to the kind of doing that and that process and going through our process, if that makes the most sense. I'm happy with that.
I know that we're over time, and I don't know without more time to be able to discuss and have like a hand raised vote how to really proceed. But if we can get just the quick comments from Bill and Rory, and then we've already lost a number of our committee members as well because they're moving on to other commitments.
My comment was actually about a different thing. I was going to suggest an agenda item, but I yield. If somebody still has a comment on the emergency declaration, I will.
I was just going to support Mary's recommendation of getting direction from the stewardship subcommittee. I think if we were to do that first, it would kind of give us credibility and bolster our efforts to do that if we already have a subset of council's support for doing it. So I think that's a good way to go about it. So
we can explore what that looks like as a next action. I can work with you on that, Cubby. Bill, what was your other agenda item?
Well, my point was, I was going to say, I think we need to add an agenda item at some point to discuss the tree ordinance, and it's come up. This wasn't the first time it's come up today. It's come up prior and in earlier meetings, and it's not. I think it's something that it isn't as maybe as controversial as a climate emergency declaration, and I don't think we should do it at our next meeting. We got to get through this prioritization process, but I think for some time in the future, maybe in the fall, when the tree leaves start falling, that we should bring that one back and have a discussion on it.
Well, I will just say on that one, a council set it in their plan as a goal to have a tree ordinance, and that is under the CDD department. There was some discussion because of council adding parking that may take precedent over the tree ordinance and what staff can put on its plate, because there will be a process. There will need to be input from development, from the wildfire perspective, from you, probably from the ECC. So I would just say that your committee probably can't act independently of Pauline Hardy, who's our planner that drafts code. What you probably want is an update from the planning department on your agenda when we're ready to move that forward. So you know the process, how you could have input. So maybe Cassie can reach out to the planning department and give you, I don't know the latest because there's been some vacations this summer, so I'm not completely clear on the timing of where it's at, but it was on their work program for the fall. I just heard a little bit that it might have gotten pushed back depending on what we're doing with parking regulations. So maybe we can give you an update on that process and when you could weigh in.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking too. I'd like to know where we're at, what, and then what people, what we think that we should discuss it, and what should we recommend in that process.
Yeah.
I'll look into where we're at with that for sure and give an update. And then at next month's meeting, if we can talk about adding it as an agenda item for maybe October or something, when we have people to vote. So on the climate emergency declaration, since we have just enough people to, one thing we could do is if there's time in the next 2 meetings, talk about what that would be and use our time with the stewardship subcommittee to ask them when we're doing the CCAP recommendations. We could potentially also ask them what they feel about a climate emergency declaration. So can we take a quick hand raise vote if you'd like to allocate some time in the next 2 meetings before we go to the council to talk about what that might look like, what that request might look like, or what that ask might look like? Is there interest in looking into climate emergency declaration? Raise your Zoom hand.
I want to understand it better, what the implications are.
So are you comfortable adding it to, basically
Yeah,
adding it to an agenda item in the next month or 2?
I'm not sure I think it's a good idea, but I want to understand it before I say that.
Okay. So that sounds like enough of you that is comfortable putting that on an agenda. That's all you're agreeing to now. Okay.
Yeah. All right, that sounds good. And then we have kind of some prioritized items on the bike rack as time allows to add chunks as we go forward, and then hopefully have more open agendas in the future. So sorry we're significantly over time, but nice work, everybody. We can just end or make a motion or something to end it, but I think we're good.
I'll make a motion to end the meeting.
Great, thanks. You can all
better second it if you're going to do a motion. I'll second it. I don't think you need to do that. You can adjourn this chair.
Okay.
Okay. Meeting's adjourned.